a lonely cowboy discovers 3 native sisters on his porch, then hears their dangerous ultimatum. Before we ride into this story, take a moment to drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from, what town or city you're calling home tonight. And when you end this story, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Now lean back, get comfortable, and enjoy the story. She walked barefoot through the snow to return what was never hers. The wind cut her like a knife, curling her dark hair across her face, but she did not flinch. In her hands, wrapped in a scrap of deerskin, lay a white handkerchief embroidered with the name Rebecca. It had been carried across prairies, through storms and hunger, and now, at the edge of a stranger's homestead, it trembled between her fingers. The cabin stood alone against the gray sweep of Nebraska winter, smoke drifting thin from its chimney. Somewhere inside was the man Rebecca had spoken of with her last breath. Somewhere inside was the choice between safety and ruin. Behind her, 2 sisters waited in the blowing snow, their shawls drawn tight, their eyes fixed on the closed door. The land was empty for miles, yet she felt watched by the wind, by the past, by the man she had yet to meet. She lifted her hand to knock and hesitated. Would he turn them away, or would he see what she could not yet bear to ask? The Nebraska winter of 1881 had a way of stripping a man to the bone. Out here, there were no second chances, no kindly neighbors a mile down the road, just wind, wolves, and the weight of your own choices. Jackson Wheeler knew all 3 well. 2 years had passed since the blizzard that took Rebecca from him, his wife, his child, yet unborn. And still, he lived as if the snow had never melted. The cabin he built with his own hands had become less a home than a tomb, each board holding the silence of her absence. He spoke to no one, unless it was for salt, flour, or ammunition. Even then, his words came few and flat, like a man conserving breath for a long journey. A tall figure, broad-shouldered from years of hard labor, Jackson wore his grief like another layer of clothing never shed, never noticed by those who had learned not to look too close. His dark hair had begun to silver at the temples, and his eyes carried the pale blue of winter skies, beautiful from a distance. Cold up close, it was into this life of deliberate loneliness that they came. 3 sisters, Cheyenne, Mahala, the eldest, with a gaze that met a man's eyes, as if weighing his soul, and finding no reason to avert her own. Nakoma, the middle sister, quieter, but her stillness was the kind that listens to more than words. And Tisa, barely past girlhood, whose beauty was quick and bright as a flame, though shadowed by something unspoken. They stood on his porch, as if carved from the same cedar beams beneath their feet, their breath drifting into the morning chill. They had not come to beg, nor to barter. They had come with a purpose, and it wore the shape of an ultimatum. Jackson had not yet learned the reason when Mahala spoke his name, the sound of it on a stranger's lips. In that clear, accented voice made him pause mid-reach for his rifle. He would learn soon enough. By sundown, she said, he must choose one of them as his wife. The snow whispered against the walls of his cabin. The wolves had been bold the night before, and now this 3 women, a demand and the ghost of Rebecca, breathing between them. He studied their faces, the steady way they held his gaze. There was no fear in them, only the quiet certainty of people who had already faced worse than the man standing in their way. Would she dare to stay? Part 1. Before we ride into this story, take a moment to drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from tonight. And when we reach the end, don't forget to rate this tale from 0 to 10. Now lean back, get comfortable, and let the prairie wind carry you into the story. The door closed behind them with a groan. the sound crawling up through the rafters like an old memory. The three sisters stepped inside without waiting for a welcome. Their soft-soled moccasins whispered against the plank floor, and still Jackson felt it, the subtle shift in the air, the way it changes just before a storm rolls in. Mahala's eyes moved slowly across the room, not with judgment, but with that cool, deliberate gaze of someone taking a man's measure in a single sweep. Her attention lingered on the empty cradle in the far corner, smooth, worn wood, touched by hands that never got to rock it. A thin quilt lay folded inside, its stitches steady and sure. Rebecca's work, Jackson saw her notice. He said nothing. Couldn't. Nakoma drifted toward the hearth, where the fire was losing its fight against the cold. She knelt, feeding the embers with a twist of dry grass drawn from a small pouch at her hip. The flame caught, throwing a brief flicker across her face, fine-boned, shadowed with the kind of grief that runs too deep for words. Tisa wandered toward the frost-blinded window. She pressed her palm against the cold glass. Her reflection ghosted over the winter beyond. Without turning, she spoke, her voice almost part of the frost itself. You live alone too long. The walls forget your voice. The words bit sharper than Jackson expected. He swallowed against them. Alone's easier, he answered, though even he heard the hollow in his own voice. Mahala turned toward him, slow, measured. Easier for a man who's already dead, she said. The truth in it nearly drove him to send them away. Nearly, but her words pinned him where he stood, like a nail through worn leather. From the folds of her dress, Mahala drew something small, wrapped in deer hide and bound with a strip of faded red cloth. She held it out. For you. He took it, reluctant, the deer hide still warm from her hand. Inside lay a single eagle feather, its tip brushed in black. Jackson knew enough to understand this was no gift. This was a sign, a mark. Something had been set in motion now, whether he willed it or not. What's this mean? He asked. Mahala's gaze did not waver. It means you are chosen, and a chosen man does not walk away. The cabin seemed to shrink around him, the air pressing close. The feather was light as breath, yet carried the weight of a winter he wasn't certain he could outlast. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters like restless bones. His eyes drifted toward the cradle in the corner, then back to the women before him. And in that narrow space between the wind's howl and the fire's crackle, Jackson understood whatever wounds they carried. They were about to tangle with his own, and wounds had a way of cutting deeper before they ever healed. Part 2. The storm had come in hard that night, fast as a door slamming in the dark. Snow pressed against the cabin walls with a steady, hungry weight, as if it meant to finish what life had started years ago. Jackson sat at the table, elbows braced, the black-tipped eagle feather lying between his hands. 2 days had passed since Mahala pressed it into his palm, yet its presence clung to him like a debt he'd never agreed to, but somehow owed. The three sisters moved through the cabin with the quiet grace of people used to small spaces and fewer words. They claimed no corner as their own, yet the place was changed. The air felt warmer, the fire held longer, and the silence, once heavy as wet wool, now carried the soft weight of their breathing, the rustle of skirts, the faint clink of a wooden ladle against an iron pot. But with them had come something else, something Jackson had not invited. Responsibility. It pressed against his chest like the edge of a dull knife. He told himself they were only passing through, that once the storm broke, they'd move on, and life would slip back into its old, familiar shape. But deep down, he knew better. A man doesn't take a feather from Mahala and expect the world to leave him untouched. The first crack in his resolve came when he stepped outside one morning to find Nakoma half buried in snow. fighting to free a mare caught in barbed wire. She worked barehanded, blood beating on her knuckles as she tugged at the wire. "You'll lose your fingers?" he barked, striding toward her. She didn't look up. "Better than losing her," she murmured, nodding toward the mare, whose flanks quivered in the cold. Jackson took out his knife and sliced the wire clean. The mare staggered free, eyes wide and rolling. Nakoma laid a gentle hand against the animal's neck, whispering in her own tongue until the trembling eased. He watched her, feeling something strange and sour turn in his gut. He'd seen enough winters to know most folks save themselves first. This one didn't. He hadn't either. Once. Later, as he patched the mare's leg in the barn's dim light, Mahala stepped into the doorway, a dark shape framed by the snow-washed world beyond. "You think she's foolish?" she said softly. "I think she doesn't know when to quit," he answered, keeping his eyes on the bandage. Mahala's boots crunched on the straw as she came closer. "Quitting is a habit," she said, "one you've practiced well." Her words hit like a thrown stone. He didn't reply. By the third day, the storm had them locked tight. The woodpile was thinning. Food was down to hard biscuits and dried beans. The four walls seemed to press in closer with each hour. At night, Jackson lay on his cot, the feather resting on the shelf above. The wind rattled the shutters like impatient hands. Sometimes, in that wind, he thought he heard voices low, urgent, impossible to understand. On the fourth morning, he found Tise kneeling by the hearth, her gaze fixed on the flames as though they might speak. In her hands, she held a small, plain wooden box. "This was my father's," she said quietly. She slid the box toward him. Inside was a single silver coin, worn smooth on one side, the faint outline of a buffalo clinging to the other. "Keep it," she said. "For when you feel lost," he started to protest. He didn't take from those who had less than him, but she closed the box and pushed it into his hands. The look in her eyes told him it wasn't a gift. It was a tether. That evening, while splitting the last of the dry wood, Jackson heard hoofbeats, not the muffled rhythm of his own mare, sharper, quicker, cutting the frozen air. 3 riders emerged from the trees, dark shapes against the white, faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats, rifles slung low. One of them, a tall man with a crooked mouth, tipped his hat. "Evening, friend. We're looking for 3 girls. Heard they came this way." Jackson's gut went cold. "What for?" he asked. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Not your concern." Inside the cabin, a board creaked. He knew they were listening. "Don't reckon I've seen 'em," he said. The man studied him a long moment before spitting into the snow. "We'll be back." They turned their horses without another word. Jackson stood there long after they'd gone, the feather burning in his pocket like it held fire. That night, the storm had quieted, but the world beyond the cabin felt sharper. He knew those men would return. He sat at the table with the silver coin in one hand and the feather in the other, 2 things he hadn't asked for, binding him tighter than chains. By the fire, the sisters spoke in low tones. He couldn't follow. Mahala met his eyes once. There was no plea there, no question, only the quiet certainty that he had already chosen a side. But choosing meant danger for them, for him. And danger was the one thing Jackson had sworn to leave behind. Near dawn, he stepped outside. The horizon was washed pale with first light. His breath curled into the cold air, fading before it could rise. His fingers closed around the feather in his pocket. The wind was still, yet he could almost hear Mahala's voice. "A chosen man does not walk away." He stared toward the tree line where the riders had vanished. Snow lay smooth and unbroken now, but he knew as sure as the scars on his hands that trouble was coming back. Part 3. The morning after the riders came, Jackson woke to a silence unlike the days before. Not the soft hush of falling snow. Not the patient stillness of the prairie at dawn. This was a hollow, waiting quiet. The kind that made a man feel the world was holding its breath. The sisters moved through the cabin with a subtle unease. Nakoma kept glancing toward the door as she worked, her long braids swinging like a dark rope against her back. Teese stood at the window, eyes fixed on the distance, her expression lost to some memory that would not let her be. Mahala sat across from him at the table, the firelight tracing the strong curve of her cheekbone. Her hands cradled a mug of tea she hadn't touched. "They will come back," she said. Jackson didn't answer. "You know this," she pressed. He looked down at the plate before him. The last of the biscuits, dry as chalk. He broke one in half, but it turned to dust in his mouth. "I don't get between men and their business anymore," he said at last. Mahala's gaze didn't falter, and yet here we are. By mid-morning, the sky hung heavy with the color of old lead. Jackson decided to split more wood, though the pile would barely last 3 days. The sharp bite of the axe into frozen rounds kept his mind from running wild until the sound of hoofbeats split the quiet again. They hadn't waited. He dropped the axe and strode to the cabin. "Stay inside," he told them, his voice low but edged. Through the drifting veil of snow, the 3 riders emerged. No polite smiles this time. The tall one with the crooked mouth leaned forward in the saddle, his eyes narrowing. "We asked polite yesterday," he said. "Today, we ain't asking." "Still don't know who you're talking about," Jackson replied, though his heartbeat had already settled into that slow, heavy rhythm he knew too well. The man swung down from his horse, boots sinking into the snow. He came close enough for Jackson to catch the sharp, sour scent of whiskey on his breath. "You lie bad," the man said evenly, "but maybe you lie less bad after we set a fire to this place." The other 2 shifted in their saddles, one letting a hand rest on the stock of his rifle. Jackson felt the silver coin in his pocket, the eagle feather lying against it. 2 truths pressed together like opposing sides of the same blade. From inside the cabin came the faint creak of a floorboard. The sisters were listening. "You burn this place," Jackson said, his voice flat as stone. "And I'll see to it the snow covers you before you hit the ground." The tall man smirked. "You alone out here? Looks that way. Then this'll be easy." His hand drifted toward the pistol at his hip. It happened in less than a breath. Jackson stepped forward, faster than his years should have allowed, shoving the man hard enough that he stumbled back into the snow. The rider with the rifle began to lift it, but Jackson's own Colt cleared leather, the barrel steady as a winter star. "Go home," he said. The tall man's smirk thinned to nothing. He looked at the gun, then into Jackson's eyes, and for a long moment, the air was thick with a choice neither man wanted to make. Finally, the man spat into the snow. "We'll be back with more than talk." They turned their horses and rode into the trees. Jackson stood there long after they were gone, snow whispering down around him, the feather burning against his side like a live coal. Inside, Mahala was waiting. She didn't ask what had been said. She didn't have to. "You've chosen," she murmured. "I chose nothing," he said. "I just told them to leave." But they both knew the truth. That night, the wind returned, prowling over the plains like a restless spirit. Jackson sat at the table, rolling the silver coin through his fingers again and again. Teese watched him for a time, then set a folded piece of buckskin in front of him. Inside was a small, hand-stitched pouch, just big enough to hang from a belt. Nestled within it lay the black-tipped eagle feather. "You keep it close now," she said. Near midnight, Jackson lit a single lantern and stepped outside. The air was brittle clear, the stars sharp as cut glass. From the ridge above the cabin, The black seam of trees stood silent against the night. Somewhere beyond them, men were waiting. For years, he'd lived in a narrow circle, keeping to himself, where no one could take anything from him again. But that circle was broken now. The riders would return, and when they did, it wouldn't just be his life on the line. He thought of the promise he'd once made to himself, never again fight for something he could lose. But as his hand closed over the pouch at his belt, he knew that promise was already gone. At the tree line, a single lantern winked in the dark, then vanished. Part 4. The storm came like 1,000 whispering ghosts, snow driving sideways out of the blackness. It hissed against the windows, rattled the shingles, prowled around the cabin like a restless hand testing the latch. Jackson had seen enough winters to know the storm itself wasn't the real trouble. The true danger was riding close behind it. Inside, the fire burned low, the sort of quiet flame meant for keeping breath in a body, not for comfort. Mahala sat by the hearth, the youngest sister sleeping against her lap. Nakoma bent over a torn blanket, mending by the careful glow of a lantern. T sat nearest the door, her gaze fixed and unreadable. Jackson moved through the room with deliberate calm. He checked the rifle, laid extra shells in a neat row on the table. Beside them, the silver coin caught a flicker of lamplight. "They'll come in the dark," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Mahala's eyes found his. "Then we will see who we are when the dark comes." By the time the first hoofbeats reached them, the wind was screaming. At first, they were faint, a dull thump in the snow, then another, until the sound gathered into a steady rhythm, the beat of a heart no one wanted to hear. Jackson blew out the lantern. The sisters melted into the shadows, moving like breath through the dim. Jackson crouched near the window, rifle braced along the sill. Through the storm's swirling veil, shapes began to form riders, their outlines bending in the wind. 3, 4, maybe more. They reined in about 30 yards from the door. One lifted a torch, its light licking upward through the snow. The tall man, with the crooked mouth, called out, his voice a thin blade in the wind. "Evenin', neighbor. We come to talk about hospitality." Sparks lifted off the torch like fireflies before dying in the dark. Jackson could see them now. Hard faces, eyes narrowed against the storm, guns hanging loose. "No talk tonight." Jackson called back, "Turn around." The tall man laughed. "Without any warmth, you alone out here don't get to give orders." He swung the torch upward. "We'll burn you out." The first shot was Jackson's. It cracked the night like a lightning strike. The torchbearer dropped his fire into the snow. Where it hissed and guttered out, chaos followed. Shouts rose. Gunfire snapped sharp against the howl of the wind. Jackson kept low, firing with the cold precision of a man long past the fear of pulling a trigger. Powder smoke rolled through the cabin. "Stay down," he barked. Bullets punched through the walls, wood splintering into the air. A jar fell from the shelf and shattered on the floor. Behind him, Mahala whispered something in her own tongue. Not fear, but a prayer. One man broke cover, running with a torch clenched in his fist. Jackson swung the rifle and fired once. The man pitched forward into the snow, the torch spinning away from him. The fight pressed closer. Hooves churned the drifts. Riders shouting orders, the storm swallowed whole. Jackson's breath steamed in the freezing air, the ache in his shoulder reminding him of old scars. A bullet slammed into the door with a heavy, wet thud. Another shattered the window frame inches from his head. "Mahala, the back," he called. In an instant, she and Nakoma had the younger girls moving toward the rear, vanishing into the blizzard toward the cut in the ridge. A path the riders would never find in a whiteout. Jackson stayed. This was the line. He loaded again by feel alone. Through the storm's veil, he caught sight of the tall man, on foot now, moving forward. with pistol drawn. Jackson's world narrowed to that figure, the steady thump of his own heart, and the cold bite of the trigger under his finger. The shot came easy. The man folded into the snow, his pistol tumbling away. For a long moment, there was only the wind and the faint ringing in Jackson's ears, then silence. The remaining riders pulled back, swallowed by the blizzard. Jackson kept the rifle ready until even the rhythm of their hoofbeats had vanished. The storm still raged, but its sound had changed, no longer a threat, but a blanket. He shut the door and bolted it. The cabin smelled of gunpowder and charred wood, the air thick with the memory of moments that had just passed. From the ridge, dark shapes emerged, Mahala and the girls, moving in single file back toward the cabin. She stepped inside, her eyes locking on his. In that long, quiet moment was the recognition of two people who had crossed the same fire and come out the other side. "You stayed," she said. "I said I would." He slipped the silver coin into the stitched pouch at his belt, the black-tipped feather tucked alongside. It felt heavier now, not for the weight of the metal, but for the weight of what it meant. Outside, the wind roamed the empty plains. Somewhere far off, wolves sang into the dark, their voices threading through the snow. Part 5. The storm left as suddenly as it came. By morning, the plains lay still under a clean sheet of white, every drift catching the pale light as if holding a secret. It had no intention of giving up. Smoke curled from the chimney in a thin gray ribbon, fading into a sky the color of old tin. Inside, the fire burned low but steady. The sisters slept in a tangle of blankets on the floor, their faces turned toward the warmth, their breathing soft and even. Mahala was awake. She sat near the hearth, knees drawn up, her back against the wall, watching the embers shift and settle. At the table, Jackson cleaned his rifle with the same slow care he might give a broken fence or a sick calf. No hurry now. Just the deliberate work of a man who knew you sometimes had to put the world back together one piece at a time. "They'll be back," he said, without looking at her. "Maybe not tomorrow. But men like that don't take losing well." Her gaze stayed on the fire. "We know, but we cannot keep running forever." The truth of it lingered between them, heavy as the smoke curling above the flames. Later, when the girls went out to fetch snow for water, Mahala came to stand beside him at the table. "You fought for us," she said. He didn't answer right away. "You've fought before," she added quietly. His eyes lifted to hers, then pale gray, like the sky before a storm. "I have," he said, "but it's been a long time since I had a reason." The wind tapped gently at the shutters, like it wanted to come in. Mahala reached into her dress pocket and set something on the table, a strip of cloth, faded red, worn thin at the edges. "My mother's scarf," she said. "She wore it the day she left us. I keep it to remember where we come from. But now," she pushed it toward him. "Now I think it belongs here." He looked at it for a long moment, then folded it carefully and slipped it into the pouch with the silver coin. No words of thanks. Some things, spoken aloud, lost their weight. That night, Jackson saddled the horse and rode out past the ridge. The air was knife cold, every breath curling into white before drifting away. Snow cracked under the hooves, a lonely sound in all that open stillness. He rode to the old cottonwood that stood like a sentinel against the sky. There, he knelt in the snow, took the pouch from his belt, and buried it at the tree's base, pressing the snow firm over the spot. A coin from his past, a scarf from hers, two lives, bound now in the same soil. When he returned, Mahala was waiting by the door, shawl drawn close. She looked at him as if she'd been listening for his return. "You buried it," she said. He nodded. "Some things you have to set down if you want to keep walking." For the first time since he'd met her, she smiled not wide, just the soft curve at the corner of her mouth. Like the first hint of dawn, the days that followed fell into a quieter rhythm. They worked side by side, mending fences, cutting wood, tending the fire. The sisters began to hum as they worked, their voices weaving together in melodies from another life. Jackson found himself listening for Mahala's voice in the mornings, for the way she guided the girls through their chores, for the familiar cadence of her steps across the cabin floor. It wasn't love, not the way townsfolk might name it. It was older, slower, like water carving a path through stone. The kind of knowing that comes from standing in the same storm and walking out the other side, changed, but unbroken. One evening, as the sun bled gold and rose across the snow, they stood together on the porch. The plains stretched empty and endless, the wind carrying only the scent of pine from far hills. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked. "Maybe," he said, "but I'll be here." Her eyes searched his. In the quiet that followed, something passed between them, not quite a promise, but the kind of truth no one needed to speak. That night, before banking the fire, Mahala rested her hand briefly over his. Her touch was warm, steady. Then she turned away to settle the girls. Jackson sat long after the cabin had gone still, the firelight painting him in golden shadow. Outside, the wind lifted and fell again, carrying with it the endless song of the plains. Winter loosened its grip at last. The snow thinned to pale islands across the grass. The creek found its voice again, and the wind shifted no longer the sharp bite of the north, but something gentler, scented with thawed earth and distant pine. By then, Jackson and Mahala had fallen into a rhythm that needed no words. Mornings began with the hiss of the stove, the creak of floorboards, and the soft pour of water into tin cups. Days blended into the steady hum of work mending, tending, feeding, punctuated by the laughter of children who had begun to believe in safety again. One evening, as the last light pooled low across the plains, Mahala stepped onto the porch. Jackson was already there, leaning against the post, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the horizon. She moved to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. The silence between them wasn't hollow anymore. It was full, deep as a well that had finally found its water. In the yard, a single red scrap of cloth fluttered from the fence post, tied there by one of the girls earlier that day. The wind caught it and made it dance against the sky. A bright flicker in the fading light. Jackson's eyes lingered on it, and his thoughts wandered to the coin sleeping beneath the cottonwood, to the things a man lets go, and the things he keeps. It came to him then, he'd been keeping more than he'd set down, keeping her, keeping them all. Tell me, what did this story stir in you? Share it in the comments and rate it from 0 to 10. And if you want more stories like this one, be sure to subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss a ride. That night, as the fire burned low and the cabin settled into sleep, Jackson sat with his boots warming by the hearth. He let the heat sink deep into his bones, listening to the quiet breathing from the other room. And for the first time in many years, he realized he wasn't waiting for something to end. He was waiting to see what might begin. And if you've ever chosen silence over revenge, leave a comment that says, "I understand, Jonas." If this story touched something in you, the next one goes even deeper. Out here, in the wide open West, not all trails lead home, but some lead to the one place you never thought you'd find again, a place worth staying.